Welcome, I'm John Caldera, president of the Independence Institute and your devil's advocate. A little later, we're going to be talking about news coverage in the newspapers about politics. But first, a look at, well, Colorado from the conservative point of view and some of the history. A friend of mine, the lovely and talented Dick Wadhams. Good to see you. How are you?
Nice to see you, John.
All right. I want to start off a little bit. You've been involved in Colorado politics now for 8 decades, and it's been amazing to watch. And I'm curious how, first of all, how you see the state changing. Were we really a red state, and are we really a purple state now or a blue state? And how big have been some of the changes that has just happened?
That is a great question because. Back when Bill Owens was governor for 2 terms and Wayne Allard rattled off a couple of Senate victories, Ben Campbell became a Republican, the legislature was totally Republican, we were not a red state during that period of time. We were a competitive purple state. We just had a very good string of victories and good candidates, and then the Democrats caught up with us. But even these last 10 years, when the Democrats dominated the statewide elections, we lost every election since 2002 until Cory won. We were still a blue state. I mean, our candidates were always in a position to win. All those Senate and gubernatorial losses we had all through the 2000s, John, were all winnable. The only one that probably wasn't was Bob Schaefer in 2008, because that was the Obama phenomenon. It was the Bush hangover. It was the collapse of Wall Street, and Bob probably didn't have a chance when it really gets down to it. But all the other races were winnable, and the Democrats just put together a better campaign and had
better money. And to be honest, I think they're more policy oriented. They want to get this done. At least the big funders, I'm talking Tim Gill and Pat Stryker and crew, they wanted to get these things done. They really didn't care that this was my guy and that's your guy. And I felt over the years the Republican team, particularly between funders and candidates, well, that's my guy, and the other rich guy goes, no, this is my guy. And that model doesn't work anymore. And I think Republicans are starting to figure this out. Talk to me about Cory Gardner's victory. How big is that?
It's so big that pursuant to our initial conversation, had he lost, John, I was about ready to concede Colorado had gone blue, because that would have meant that we would have lost every election since 2002 for governor and senator. And we would have lost with probably the most talented candidate we've seen since Bill Armstrong and Hank Brown and Bill Owens. And I mean, had Cory lost that election, it would have invited the question, who can win in Colorado as a Republican if he can't against that weak of an incumbent, as Udall turned out to be, in this kind of a political environment? And so his win was huge. It was also huge from a historic perspective.
How so?
36 years it had been since any senator had been unseated for re-election, and that was
the power of the incumbency. 36 years. I mean, it
is. Yeah. I mean, Bill Armstrong defeated Floyd Haskell in 1978. And by the way, the interesting thing about that was the 3rd consecutive Senate election where an incumbent had been unseated. I mean,
so there was. It used to be a state where real change could happen. An incumbent was not safe the way that incumbents are safe today.
That's right. Especially, but governors even worse. I mean, we have not had an incumbent elected governor unseated since 1962, 52 years ago. Now, it's very hard to unseat a governor. Coloradans like to love their governor. Yeah. And they normally do, actually.
Although this time around, Hickenlooper winning by 3 points, while that's a comfortable win, if you asked me a year or so earlier, there would be no way a Republican could get within single digits. Right. That's what my thought. Am I wrong?
You're right. I mean, Hickenlooper should have won by a much bigger margin. We thought he would. But then, of course, the gun laws got passed. The worst thing that happened to him, obviously, was when the Democrats took control of the legislature in 2012, because it sent him all that crap that he signed, that he should have had the guts to veto.
It showed that he couldn't. He doesn't want to anger somebody. Right. I got to say that all politicians have a need to be loved, an addiction to be loved. That's but this governor, I think especially, needs to be loved, and not every issue is an 80-20 issue where you can do this. And he couldn't say no that year.
No,
not to a thing.
And I think the appearance before the sheriffs was very instructive, because it wasn't that he went to meet with the sheriffs. That was okay. In fact, I think that might have been a home run for him. But when he went in front of them and basically
let's be honest.
Didn't tell the truth.
When he lied, said, "I never spoke to Mayor Bloomberg."
Yes, and said, "I didn't know how bad a bill that was when I signed it.
I didn't know it was going to be that controversial."
That's right.
I mean, and which is too bad, because it really goes against the image he's cultivated over these years as being a likable guy who will talk freely with you and honestly. And I think that really opened it up. I want to ask you a little bit about history, going back, because so many people have moved into this state. We're old timers. We need to keep the flame going. We have some great personalities in Colorado history. You, of course, worked to help elect Wayne Allard, who did two terms in the U.S. Senate, and of course Bill Owens, the first Republican to win governor in 24 years, when he won back in, what was that?
98.
98.
And the only one now, John, in 40 years.
The only Republican in 40 years.
Yes. Yeah.
And I remember on election night, I was down there at whatever hotel it was, and we didn't know if he was going to win. It was 8,000 votes, and it was this tight.
It was.
Yeah, and that was one of your better victories. I wouldn't want to. Poor Bill, he had no fingernails at the end of the night.
It was a late night.
But I want to go backward to a couple from my childhood. I remember Governor Love in the early 70s, but just kind of, and I think it was Vanderhoof before that. But really, I kind of grew up with Dick Lamb, and Dick Lamb's a Democrat. He had 3 terms here, and I've become friends with Dick Lamb since. What an amazing guy. Tell me about the difference between Lamb and Romer and Democrats of that age compared to now. There's just, it's a whole different flavor, and I struggle to describe it.
What's interesting, John, is that all through the 1960s, Republicans totally dominated. You mentioned Governor John Love, such a giant of our party and state back in the 60s. John Vanderhoof succeeded him, Senator Gordon Allett, Senator Peter Dominick, and then Watergate showed up. Yeah. That whole generation either resigned or got defeated for re-election.
Even the 2nd Congressional, where I live in Boulder, had Republican...
Don Brotzman.
Yeah, had Republican congressmen up until Watergate, and not a single one since.
The 1st Congressional District of Denver had a Republican congressman until Watergate. But what happened was Dick Lamb, he could see the state was changing. And remember, what really propelled him was 1972, when he got on the ballot and a referendum to turn down the Winter Olympics of 1976.
I remember it.
And, what's interesting, a lot of Republicans supported him in that effort. A lot of Republicans were very dubious about bringing the Winter Olympics to Colorado in 1976. And so suddenly he has this very successful initiative or referendum, whatever it was at the time, and it propels him into being the Democratic nominee. And he unseats the Republican incumbent, and he walks the state. That was kind of in vogue back in the early 1970s. A lot of candidates did it around the country. But I remember him walking into my hometown in southeastern Colorado and looking at this guy, and he became governor of Colorado. But he never was a... Dick Lamb was always an interesting guy. He got off to such a bad start in his governorship. The famous speech in front of the Colorado Press Association, when they introduced him to speak and they didn't stand, he literally shouted into the microphone, "Stand up, goddammit." And his relations with you ought to talk to his former press secretary, Carl Miller, about that. And he had Wellington Webb and some other Hispanic and African American lawmakers walked out of his inaugural address because he had not appointed enough minority members as a part of his cabinet and staff. This guy started off on the worst footing, and yet he went on to serve 12 years as governor and never really was touched in any general election.
I didn't realize that Roy Romer was a chief of staff for then was still a younger Dick Lamb, and that helped propel him.
Yes.
Tell me a little bit about Roy Romer. He is an amazing character in Colorado history, in that here's a guy who ran for statewide Senate win in the
1966.
1966?
He got elected to the legislature in the 1950s from Denver, state senator. And then he was the Democratic nominee against a very popular U.S. senator at the time, Senator Gordon Allott. Allott killed him, just blew him away in that election. Romer basically exited politics for a while, devoted his time to business. And all of a sudden, Dick Lamb brings him back as state treasurer when the incumbent Democrat resigned to go to work for Jimmy Carter. And then he says, Roy, would you also be my chief of staff while you're state treasurer? And then...
So you're state treasurer and...
Yeah.
Right. And then from state treasurer...
Dick Lamb didn't run for a fourth term.
Right.
And he became the de facto, or he was the presumed nominee.
And I got to say, again, it's just kind of in my lifetime. Lamb, Romer, Bill Owens,
yes.
Despite policy differences, they were really strong executives.
Yes.
They understood the machinery, they made tough decisions, they were intimidating as hell if you went up against them, and they really knew how to work that. Our last two governors are fish out of water. They don't seem to know that. What's the difference?
There's one interesting. All three of those governors served in the legislature, and in the case of Romer and Owens, they served as state treasurer.
Right.
They served, but more importantly, they all were very steeped in state government, which is kind of an arcane.
Yeah, it's a very different thing than running a city or a DA's office.
Or frankly, the issues are much more complicated than federal issues when it really gets down to it. And so I think they had a handle and a grasp of state government. They understood the legislature, and I think that's what hurt Governor Ritter and Governor Hickenlooper as well. They did not have that experience.
But also, you go from DA or mayor, where you have a lot of authority.
Right.
You can make decisions, and you can affect change, to a place where you got 100 other people that you have to work with to get anything done. Plus, you got to keep the machinery going.
Right.
So, you told me the story the other day. I loved it. Meeting Roy Romer. I had breakfast with Roy Romer a few months ago, and he looks the same. He's 86 years old, and he looks exactly the same and as sharp as he ever was.
Yeah.
But I remember he was an intimidating governor.
Yes, he was. You know, I had not met Roy Romer, and I was at a meeting in Washington accompanying Senator Allard, who I was working for at the time. And Governor Romer was there. It was a National Governors Association or something. And I told Senator Allard, I've never met Governor Romer. So he said, well, come on. So we went over, and Senator Allard said, Governor Romer, this is my campaign manager and now my press secretary, Dick Wadhams. And Romer looked at me, and without me, never flinched, walked up to me, poked his fingers into my chest and said, you are an SOB.
Oh, he said son of a bitch.
Well, he did.
Yeah, that's right.
He did. He actually did. And I was kind of stunned, didn't quite know what to say.
Right. The governor is calling you a son of a bitch and physically assaulting you.
And I had no idea what to do. And he quickly got a smile on his face, and he said, and that's a compliment. And then we had a nice,
and that's, both Dick and Romer and Bill Owens, they had a way to connect with people that was less slick, less computer generated or marketing generated. They just had that. It was an interesting time.
When they went into a room, John, you knew the governor of Colorado was sitting. It was in that room, and they had a command of what was going on, what was being talked about, and I never saw Bill Owens unprepared whenever I worked for him.
There was also, and we got to finish this up, but there was also, I don't want to say politeness or civility because it gets overused, but between R&D, it wasn't ugly, it wasn't vicious, it wasn't chop them off at the knees, let's do nasty ads. It was a time where you believe in this, I believe in that. We're going to tell the voters that, and they're going to decide.
They were all three very policy driven. They were all very substantive. They enjoyed the public debate and the public forum, and they all enjoyed politics too. They were all pretty darn good at it, but they were driven by what they wanted to accomplish in office, and I think that's what sets them apart.
I'm going to say campaign finance laws made the difference. Once campaign finance laws came in, money couldn't go to candidates. Money went to independent expenditure committees and 527s and C4s and all these other outlets, and they became hatchet jobs. And the candidate doesn't run his own election any longer.
Yeah.
So it wasn't him calling the shots.
And I hate that, John. It's every time we try to reform campaign finance, we make it worse. We make it more unaccountable. We strip the parties and candidates of the ability to run elections, and it's bad for the process.
Always good running down memory lane. Dick Wadhams, thank you.
Nice to see you.
Stay tuned.